I wanted to emphasize a few broad points from yesterday's discussion, yesterday's coverage, to make sure that they carried across to those who were here, and for those who couldn't be here, to make clear some of the salient themes, both because I'd like you to walk away with them regardless of whether you can make it, and because it might motivate you to go back and review the lecture on video. Okay. So a few broad themes I introduced yesterday. I had told you that I'm coming from a certain disciplinary perspective. It is an interdisciplinary perspective. I've been working across the boundaries from computer science now for over 30 years, probably before some of you folks were born. And for 20 years of that really focused on health applications of computer science and informatics. But I have a particular stance or a particular sort of point of view in that, which recognizes the importance of data science, but it does so in the context of working with some of the most gnarly problems out there we have to face as a society and as a globe. These wicked problems like global climate change, issues having to do with economic injustices, but also problems that confront our health and healthcare systems, which are legion and which are varied in their manifestations. And that's the area, the latter is the area in which I've chosen to focus. But it's indicative of a lot of the problems we face as a society. And these complex systems, to address them effectively, it requires understanding systems as a whole, not purely in terms of their pieces, because they are at a technical level complex in the sense that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So you can't understand them simply by taking them apart into pieces, understanding each piece, and then thinking that that's going to give you an understanding of the system as a whole. Any more so that you can understand traffic jams by being a real expert in car engines and car tires and axles. To understand traffic jams takes a lot more than understanding the details of cars, but the details of cars are important, because if cars break down, every 5 minutes, you've got a lot of traffic jams. So understanding these complex phenomena, these emergent phenomena, requires an understanding not only of the pieces, but an integrative ability to piece those together to understand how their interactions affect the system as a whole. And that's different than understanding the pieces. Now, when it comes to the enterprise of understanding those systems, it's my conviction that data science plays an absolutely key role. The insights we can secure from empirical data are absolutely central for allowing us to reliably understand, reason about, and effectively manage, make decisions in these complex systems. But that lends me a certain stance with respect to data science that lends a certain unity to the different data sets we're collecting, recognizing that they're not springing full-born out of the world, each in isolation as a solitude, like Athena from Zeus's head, but instead that they're coming from common underlying systems by which they're related. They're close cousins of each other. They're different faces of a common underlying system. And understanding things in one data set can often give you a lot of understanding to another. And there's a certain amount of our work, say in convergent cross-mapping methods, where that's a central theme. But it came out yesterday in the sense that we were reasoning about underlying systems generating the patterns that we see in data sets, where more than one data set might come from the same underlying system. And I argued yesterday that reasoning about the underlying systems that give rise to that data, the data generating processes, is of key importance, because whilst the data that we collect gives us great insight into those systems, often in the human condition, we're interested more than being detached observers from these systems. We're interested in intervening, bending things for the better, bending the curves of public health towards greater health, bending the situations associated with community safety and well-being towards occurrences of less domestic violence and reduced risk of opioid addiction, et cetera. We're interested in making the difference. And when we want to make a difference, we have to realize that we're talking about altering the underlying system. We're intervening in it, and we're intervening in a way that alters it such that it alters the data generating process. And that's going to throw off some statistical regularities that we may have been looking at with the data, some associations, some correlations. And I argue to do this reliably requires something that's just coming to the fore, ladies and gentlemen, with data science. To wit, causal reasoning. Reasoning about causation. It is that causal reasoning that helps us reason about counterfactuals. This is a hot new area of data science, but it's one that's occupied me for the past 30 years, since I wore a very younger man's shoes between my undergrad and graduate years at MIT, and I first started getting into complex systems. And when it comes to the prospect of data science, it requires an appreciation for how these different pieces of the system, statistical patterns we observe, are contingent on that data generating process, and the ability to be open to modeling, whether it's statistical or dynamical, as we saw yesterday, that captures causality. Why capture causality? Well, I'll tell you one of the big reasons people seek to capture causality these days. It's for explainability. What is going on in this underlying system? Having something more than a black box, but something that posits connections that can be explained to a clinician or to someone who's an expert in the health system or to someone who understands psychology. And that's attracted a lot of attention, but there's other things as well. There's attribution. Why do we see these phenomena? And I would argue, arguably the most importantly, there's being able to reason about counterfactuals. If we do X, how will it change the situation? And to reason about this, we need models that are up to it. Judea Pearl has articulated in some wonderful contributions coming out of UCLA, a very cohesive causal modeling framework by which posited causal relationships, as first recognized by Sewell Wright, for example, in the early 1900s, in terms of statistical significance, are laid out in a very systematic theory with guidance as to how to quantify the strength of connections within those causal frameworks. Yesterday I showed you dynamic modeling, state-space modeling, which captures causality in the form of dynamic models. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be continuing on that some this afternoon. This morning, we will also see the use of models. And all of these models that I'm showing you, yesterday, this afternoon, and in this lecture indeed, capture theory. They capture theory of model structure. How things are connected in the model. And in many cases, they do so in a causal fashion. I wanted to big emphasis today, which is more observational understanding, this morning, but this afternoon it'll come roaring back. So yesterday we saw how we could mesh theory captured in dynamic models with machine learning approach in the form of particle filtering to bring the two together. And it brought together dynamic models with incoming data, for example, streamed from various sources incrementally, in a way that gave the best of both worlds, in the way that that corrects for the model or clues it into stochastics in the system that may be taking the system in a different direction, so that it's always dealing with an up-to-date understanding of what's the current situation, and by extension, through the power of the model, where is this going, and what might come next, and what might be the trade-offs between different interventions if I undertook them now. So really, at a big level, that's what particle filtering is about. And there's earlier methods from the 1950s. Rudolf Kalman, in a remarkable contribution, defined the Kalman filter, which was the first big step, big leap in that direction, but was encumbered by many, many restrictions that the particle filter relaxes. Okay? And the significance of what we saw yesterday is profound, because it's really about a wholesale meshing of system science, the ability to reason about complex systems and represent those complex systems in a theory-rich way with data science. And I'm a big believer in other ways of bringing the two together, including with theory-based models and some non-theory-based models capturing certain regularities, such as deep learning models. So I took a stance yesterday, and you'll see that continued today. But the methods yesterday were fundamentally about representing systems using a theory-based method and using particle filtering, this computational statistical approach, to mesh that theory-based model with incoming data in a way that corrected it, allows us to estimate the underlying state, project forward what's going to happen probabilistically, and ask what-if questions. That's really what yesterday was about. When we saw a certain type of data, I promised I'm going to try in each lecture to introduce you to a little bit of novel data sources, as well as to talk about machine learning, and perhaps to give a bit of philosophy. And yesterday I showed you search data, and indeed that figured prominently in one of the examples, an example associated with H1N1 flu outbreaks in Manitoba and in Quebec. So that was yesterday. We saw particles. The particle filter worked through particles, and each particle represented a sample from an underlying distribution. But it wasn't a sample that can be taken in isolation as that value in isolation. Not all samples were equal. All samples had weights associated with them, and some of those weights were higher than others. A weight of 1 versus a weight of 0.5 indicates, I'll say a weight of 0.5 versus 0.25 indicates that one with 0.5 sort of counts twice as much in the underlying distribution as the one with 0.25. And we saw that we could run these dynamic models with these swarms of particles. It was almost an ensemble method where each particle represented a different hypothesis about what's going on in the underlying system. And where running the simulation model will be running in this ensemble of different hypotheses as to what's going on. And at any one time, there's a distribution implied by those hypotheses. But we always sample from that distribution, sample from the particles, the samples, in a way that's the probability of getting a given sample is proportional to its weight. So yesterday we had all this buzzing, blooming confusion associated with these different things: search data, search volume data, dynamic models, particle filter method, etc. And I hope you'll take away those broad outlines of what I was trying to communicate, because it's pointing you in many ways to a very important line, direction in which data science is moving, which is dealing explicitly in a fundamental way with causality. That'll be right on the front. Okay. I'd like to open this to ask, are there any questions about yesterday's material that I can answer? I put up some slides yesterday which had points of note and conclusions. I'll put them out there if anyone wants to use them to ask questions or stimulate your memory of what I talked about. questions I can answer. Wait.
I don't know, maybe you could make a couple comments on the term wicked problems, because I think it's probably used
Sure.
to many people.
Sure. I'm not going to be able to do it justice. It's not a term I use a huge amount, but I will give you the essence of it. Wicked problems are a subclass of complex problems, or problems involving complex systems. When I say complex here, it's important to note, I'm not speaking about systems that are merely complicated, with lots of moving parts. I'm speaking about systems that are complex in a technical sense, in a sense that the behavior of the whole is not the same as the average or sum of the behavior of the different pieces. Okay, and complexity is associated most specifically with nonlinearity in the underlying system. When we have a function that's nonlinear, and we have a evolving system, a dynamic system that's nonlinear, we can't analyze it nearly as easily as with a linear system. With a linear system, we can understand how the system will behave with respect to intervention A and intervention B together by understanding how it behaves with each in isolation and then just sum up the total. Is anyone here from engineering background? Good man. Okay, so have folks here seen Fourier transforms before? A little bit? Okay, good. Yeah, they're starting to make their way into other domains. Back when I was young, I know you think the world was still cooling then, but when I was young, the engineering was the main place you'd see Fourier transforms, plus of course our cognate mathematicians. But in Fourier transforms, the idea is to understand, often it's used in engineering to say, okay, we have this system here, and we have a signal, an input, something that's going into this system. To figure out how the system's going to behave on that input, all we have to do is take the input apart into pieces. In this case, they're sinusoids. We know how the system will behave with respect to each of those sinusoids, and so by extension, we know how the system behaves with respect to the whole because it's a linear time invariant system. And so we take the input apart into pieces, we know how the system will behave with respect to each of them, and we just sum up those responses to get the output for the system as a whole. And with nonlinear systems, that doesn't work. It works for nice linear systems, linear time invariant systems, but with nonlinear systems, it doesn't work. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Okay, and these systems are rife. They are typical in the domain of human activity, human theater. And they have to do with systems that are surprising. They blow back to us. This is why, we can't make easy policy with respect to a lot of things, because we are surprised by the results. We think, if we intervene in this way, it's gonna yield this result. But in complex systems, the results of that intervention are delayed often. They are nonlinear, so just a little bit more intervention yields a tipping point, for example. Take with vaccination. That totally changes the situation. We don't have ways of intuitively reasoning about it. The effects are distal in time often, so delay, but distal in space or within the system where they pop out. So we intervene here and it pops out there. We change doctors' prescription policies with respect to opioids, and suddenly we have police responding to all these opioid deaths. We restrict what doctors can prescribe in opioids. The patients who have been counting on opioids to feed a hidden addiction can't get their drugs through their physicians anymore. They go to the street to get them. They get less controlled opioids from dealers, adulterated opioids. They only get them episodically, and so the tolerance is going up and down. And chances are within 6 months to a year, they will overdose. And so you intervene over here in health, and it pops out over here in social services and justice, corrections, and policing. This is the nature of complex systems. We try to manage them in ways we're used to managing linear systems, and we get policies that encounter what's called policy resistance. They are diluted or defeated or even reversed in their effects because we're dealing with complexity. We're dealing with surprising effects. And for this reason, we build models and we try to reason about these systems. And we ground those models with data science. Those are complex systems. Now, a subpart of complex systems deals with wicked problems. We have complex problems, which are a broader set, and then we have wicked problems. And wicked problems are particularly societally gnarly. They can't be addressed through any one discipline. They can't be addressed through merely traditional incremental means. They require a wholesale rethinking about the methods we use. They require creation of new methods to effectively grapple with them, just as building giant engineering projects. In engineering, we talk about mega projects in civil engineering. Projects like the Hoover Dam that required a whole industry to be created in an area that was desert in order to build this dam, okay? And similarly with the pyramids or something like that. These are large-scale endeavors to address wicked problems, but more deeply, wicked problems require us as a society to grapple with our values. What is it that's important? Let's say with opioids. What are we trying to do with opioids? Are we trying to reduce drug addiction? Are we trying to reduce drug addiction that leads to disorder, to people who can't lead their lives productively, whose families fall apart, can't keep jobs, are just constantly craving this drug in a way that's completely debilitating for their relationships and their ability to function? Is that what we're trying to prevent with talking about lowering the harm of opioids? Is it that we're trying to stop opioid deaths from occurring? Would we be happy if we could feed everyone who's addicted to opioids for the rest of their life? They stay addicted, but they are disordered and they're unable to work because of that, but they're alive. Or alternatively, if we can keep them alive in a functional way by administering them heroin injections every day, this is done on an experimental basis, for example, in some programs in BC. If we could have everyone who's opioid addicted come in for a heroin addiction every day, and they lead a quite functional life, they go off to work after it and work through the day, which is what happens for large classes of patients, would that be an acceptable solution to us as a society? Or for climate change, what are our fundamental values we're trying to realize? And wicked problems are associated with conflicts in those values. They're associated with challenges for defining what is a good solution that require a lot of deep thinking. And there's quite a few problems like this. Problems of pollution and the ocean, for example, to mention another one that's very prominent. These are problems which gnaw at us as a society, which expose societal divisions, which are complex, but where the terms of reference, the terms by which we think about them, are themselves contested. And we're trying to do something to fix this problem, which is difficult in the first place because it's complex and because our interventions yield weird outcomes. But meanwhile, we've got this dissonance going on, and even how to describe it or what we're after, that's got to be dealt with. And some of humanity's most pressing problems are of this sort. Nuclear weapons, or and nuclear, actually the whole set of issues involving nuclear power and proliferation, nuclear weapons, it's another whole area. And another area where wicked problems arise. And there's a lot of these in today's society that dominate, a lot of our generational challenges. So those are some comments on wicked problems, but you can find far more articulate observers than I who can give a better definition. Okay? Okay. Great question. Other questions? Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be here with you to share your attention. And I would welcome questions at any point, okay? I recognize that the material that I'm covering has many different challenges for different people in the room. Please speak up if there is something I can do to address that. But if there's no, so I'll ask one more time. Any questions that I can answer right now before we move on to the substantive materials for this morning? So I think we'll move on. I will cease this recording, and I will begin the recording, which deals with our subject